Wee, look at that!
Now, James, I thought I told you to ask my permission before using my new stereoscope. It's not a toy, you know.
Ooh la la! So that's little Egypt doing the hootchy-kootchy, eh, Dad?
Who was Little Egypt, and what was the hootchy-kootchy? In 1893, Chicago would find itself as the host of the world's Columbian Exposition, otherwise known as the Chicago World's Fair. Like most world fairs, it was intended to be an event in which cultures and technological progress from around the world could be showcased for guests to enjoy. Part of this World's Fair included a park called the Midway Plaisance, which focused less on the exposition part of the fair and more on the entertainment and amusements. Fun side note, but the Midway Plaisance is what would eventually popularize the term Midway to describe the games and amusements we think of today when we think of a Midway. Now, the previous fair, the Paris International Exposition, wowed guests by featuring a tower that climbed to heights of over 300 meters. The Eiffel Tower was an architectural marvel, and one that Chicago wanted to top. Rather than besting it by building something even taller, how about something that moved? The Chicago World's Fair would feature a 25-story tall rotating viewing wheel that was designed by a man named George Washington Ferris. Unfortunately, due to the scope of the project, Ferris's wheel was not ready by the time the fair opened. It would end up taking an extra month to finish the project. While this was understandably a disappointment to fair guests, this was a benefit for other amusements and entertainment acts in the area that didn't have to worry about the impressive Ferris wheel stealing the spotlight. One of those amusements was an area right across from the Ferris wheel called a street in Cairo. As the name implied, it was a recreation of a street area in Egypt. It offered camel rides, a recreation of the Temple of Luxor, and a 1,500-seat theater which ran performances all day from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. One of those performers was a dancer from Damascus, not Egypt, named Farida Mazar. Mazar was a belly dancer. However, at that point, the dance style wasn't called belly dancing. It was sometimes referred to as danse du ventre, which literally translates to belly dance. However, American audiences weren't as quick to adopt the French name and instead began to refer to it, among other names, as the hootchy-kootchy. Already benefiting from the lack of a competing Ferris wheel, it was alleged that act organizer Solomon Blum helped the act further by stirring up a little controversy. He supposedly convinced a minister to publicly condemn the act, which, of course, piqued the interest of fairgoers even more. And there was one more contribution Blum took credit for, which was the music. He claimed he had come up with the Streets of Cairo melody that has today become somewhat synonymous with belly dancing and snake charming.
I will sing you a song, and it won't be very long, about a maiden sweet, and she never would do wrong. Everyone said she was pretty, she was not long in the city, all alone, oh what a pity, poor little maid.
However, later publications traced the tune back to an 18th century Algerian melody. Whether or not Blum originally created the tune, his use of it in the act certainly popularized it in the West. Now at this point, stories begin to get even more muddied and the truth slips into the unknown. Legend and most online sources claim that Blum gave the act the name of Little Egypt. However, years later, Blum would deny it and even pointed out that during the fair, the act was never publicized as Little Egypt. Regardless, the dancing act eventually started to pick up the moniker from the public. Since the popular performance ran all day and involved multiple dancers, who, after the fair, would then move on to perform elsewhere, the US began to see multiple instances of Little Egypt acts. In 1895, the Little Egypt act made its way to New York City at Coney Island. And before long, most general belly dancing acts were just referred to by default as Little Egypt. Think about how crazy that is for a second. Imagine if the Beatles split up and then Paul and John each started their own band called the Beatles, and then Ringo and George did the same exact thing. And then other bands started popping up and they called themselves the Beatles as well. And then before you know it, all British pop music just was called the Beatles. That's what it was like with Little Egypt. At that point, Farida Mazar was claiming credit for being the original Little Egypt, but there's no one definitive source that confirms it. And while Little Egypt's popularity began to wane after the turn of the century, the organizers of the upcoming Louisiana Purchase Exposition, otherwise known as the St. Louis World's Fair, were not about to turn down a sure shot when it came to entertainment. So, taking a page from the Chicago World's Fair, they planned for their own street in Cairo, complete with their own Little Egypt act. So that is the Little Egypt doing the hootchy-kootchy that John's son is looking at in the Carousel of Progress. It wasn't the original Little Egypt, and the act itself was far from new, but it was a popular showing nonetheless. Speaking of looking at her, what exactly was he looking at her with? Well, as John states, it's his stereoscope. It's a device that was invented in the 1830s that creates a 3D illusion. Similar to 3D today, a card with two photos that are nearly identical but taken at very slightly different angles is placed in the viewer. With each eye seeing one of the photos, much in the same way our eyes see objects from two slightly different angles, the illusion of depth is created. By the 1850s, the device had grown in popularity in the UK, and shortly after, an American surgeon named Oliver Wendell Holmes created a cheaper and more simplified version of the device. He intentionally didn't patent the design, and with the resulting low cost of the stereoscope, the fad came into popularity in the US. At 45 cents to 75 cents, stereoscopes would cost us around $15 to $20 today, meaning they were accessible to most people, which further helped spread the craze. The stereoscope remained fairly popular until the early 1900s, when radio would come around and take over as the new novel living room amusement. So when John's son is looking at Little Egypt through his dad's stereoscope, it was closer towards the end of both Little Egypt and the stereoscope's popularity. It's just one line of dialogue in a 20-minute long show. But like most of the show, it's a line of dialogue packed with history.